So you've heard of a 51% attack on Bitcoin, but did you know there are other ways Bitcoin is vulnerable? These things are a little more sneaky and insidious. So I have the subject matter expert, PortlandHODL, here on Bitcoin Season 2. Bitcoin Season 2 is brought to you by Arch Network, the platform building bridgeless apps on Bitcoin. More on Arch later on the show. Let's kick it off. Portland, welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2. It's been a year. It's been a big year, and you're back on the show. Yeah. I would recommend anybody go back and listen to our previous conversation on YouTube. You can find it if you know how to Google something. But it's been a big year, Portland. I actually want to, and I don't even want to give an intro. I just want to hook the audience in. I'm going to ask you a pretty direct question. What do you think the greatest threat to Bitcoin is right now?
Oh boy. I'm going to go with two abstract threats and then one actual, it is a definite problem that if exploited is really bad. My two abstract kind of threats would be slow moving changes to social consensus. Like over a very long period of time, does Bitcoin look anything like what we have today? Is Bitcoin still functional, right? Bitcoin is a bunch of nodes and users that interact with the network, right? And if suddenly the rules of the network maybe become too restrictive, maybe Bitcoin becomes purely pay to pub keys, or maybe it becomes too loose for some reason. But what does Bitcoin look like? Maybe even hard forks, right? Those are the kind of things that are not good for slow moving changes to social consensus. Next on the list, 100% working for Marathon Digital Holdings, currently as a part-time consultant. Miner centralization would be the second abstract threat to Bitcoin. 51% attacks or collusion between large pools to censor transactions would violate one of, in my opinion, the fundamental properties of Bitcoin, which is permissionlessness. Anybody can interact with this. And then this leads into the actual thing that's here today that we should not want to happen by anybody, that Antoine Poinsot is working on fixing right now through the Great Consensus Cleanup that I demoed at OpNext in April, which is the poison blocks, or aka if a miner, nation state, or a troll with a lot of Bitcoin from the early days, maybe he's become a brand new minted ETH maxi and he wants to, maybe he's got some BTC. He's like, this is my short. This is how I'm going to end up with more Bitcoin. You can absolutely create havoc on the Bitcoin network by releasing a Bitcoin block that is very difficult to add into the chain, to the tune of the time it takes this block to get added to the chain is actually longer than the average time for a block to get mined. So when this kind of thing happens, this block can take 25 minutes for a miner to churn through it. Nothing's happening for that miner on the Bitcoin network during that time. And this thing, if you get it to enough nodes or you're targeted enough to know, hey, Foundry, Mara, F2, you can stall out large portions of the network just by crafting a very specific block. And this is all within Bitcoin consensus. These are all completely valid transactions on Bitcoin you can do today. There's sort of some hiccups in trying to get them mined. But if you're a nation state, yeah, you could absolutely kind of make this happen on your own. And as a side note, this goes back to I kind of made this slide at OpNext, but in 2024, the first OpNext, I stated that nation state adoption, what I mean by that is could a nation state reasonably adopt Bitcoin as their money, displacing their current currency and use only Bitcoin? And I deemed that to be pretty irresponsible until something like this is cleaned up, because I couldn't imagine 8 million or 100 million people or even 1 billion people not being able to use their financial system because of a consensus gotcha that should have been patched back in 2013 when it was first discovered. So
this is you set this up perfectly. You answered this exactly as I was hoping to, so that I could frame the discussion. And now for the listener who kind of maybe followed what you said, let's try to build up this, build into explaining what you mean by a poison block or a DOS block. With the very basics, we're going to roll this back to maybe a Bitcoin 101. This might actually be more of a Bitcoin 201 or 301 class. But I think kind of there's that Schoolhouse Rock video on how a bill becomes a law. I'm going to invite you to try to explain how a Bitcoin block is made. I think you have a good analogy, but we'll start with analogy and then we'll go into like the tactical way it works.
The analogy actually works really well for the poison block. I got a way to describe it. So, basically in Bitcoin, there are what are called blocks. And what these blocks are, they're basically like delivered or truckloads of transactions that get to the destination, which is the time chain. There are all these packages that want to get onto the time chain, all these transactions, but only a certain amount can get on there per 10 minutes. And that's called your 1 megabyte block or the size limit. So my analogy to this would be basically like you have like a city like Portland, Oregon, and you have a bunch of people who need to get goods to New York. And so you have one delivery driver who will be able to drive these packages. There is no other delivery driver. There's only one chain in Bitcoin that you can add to. There's one truck per 10 minutes that leaves this city to go to New York. And so outside of the shipping facility, you have a mob of people who are like, hey, I got to get my transaction. I got a letter to grandma. I got a stock trade or stock certificates that got to make it to New York City. I got like some dangerous packages maybe that got to get there. But like at the end of the day, like how do you figure out like who gets in this truck? Because there's too many people. You can't fit all this stuff. How do you deal with somebody who wants to ship a bunch of lead weights across the United States, right? And so in Bitcoin, it's very simple. The transactions with the highest fees get into the block in the same manner that my shipping courier that goes to New York or the truck that leaves to New York, he basically asks everybody in the audience, how much can you pay for this? How much will you give me today? And the first participant will raise his hand. I'll pay you $10, get it to New York. A bunch of other people, $100. The block's almost full. Okay. The guy goes, okay, I'll replace mine. I'll do 101 just to get in. Right. And then at the end of that 10 minutes, whatever's in that truck is leaving. There's nobody else who can like get their stuff in this truck. They have to go onto the next truck. And so the interesting thing about this is that it creates like a kind of thing is like what's going into the truck and getting shipped and what like the value of the thing or like how difficult is it to ship and how this kind of relates to my topic is in Bitcoin, we have what's called standardness rules. This truck, like the standardness policies protect the Bitcoin blocks from basically getting anything that's kind of dangerous or undesirable in there. And what is dangerous and undesirable has been a hot topic of debate recently between is just putting your name in an op return dangerous or undesirable? Is putting a 4 megabyte wizard in a block dangerous or undesirable? Or is creating a poison block or a bunch of transactions that have a bunch of signature checks that are very difficult to deal with a problem? My stance is very clear. Things that stop a Bitcoin node are the things that consensus should remove from Bitcoin, and we should not just depend on like this standardness policy. But with that said, back to the analogy. So the analogy is like the shipper, right? And so we got a bunch of people outside, ship my packages. And then let's give some examples of some problematic things. Because the shipper is going to have like a list on the side of his van that says, hey, I can only take these things. And the only reason he can only take those things is because he's told by somebody he can only take those things. It's not that he couldn't take these other things, but let's talk about
it's still fits in the truck, but it's just not on the list.
Yeah. So like one of the things is like, or maybe he has a list of things I'm not going to take. But in Bitcoin, we have a list of things we will take. Everything else is not taken. So some examples are maybe a customer goes, hey, I want to ship like a bunch of helium gas, right? It's kind of a problem. It could leak and the driver might have a high pitched voice or get dizzy. Okay. He's going to go, no, I can't take this helium gas in the truck, even though it's very shippable. Like batteries would be another thing, like flammable hazard. There's all sorts of things people will not ship. Maybe somebody wants to ship something to New York they don't allow. Maybe it's a jurisdictional issue for an item. Like that's kind of like what policy is. It filters out these packages from causing problems for the shipping company or the driver. You don't want any of this. You want to make sure that this block gets to the other side, Portland to New York, every 10 minutes, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. And so the kind of thing we're going to talk about today is like the weight of the package. Because right now, the only thing that determines like the truck analogy and why it's not perfect is because we don't take into account how heavy it is relative to the cost. We're just saying, will it fit in there? But let's say somebody, the DOS block or this block that takes a very long time, in the shipping company example, here's where it gets to be problematic. Okay, you got a bunch of people outside. Okay, so the driver goes, the package will fit in my truck, Okay. You bid the correct amount and the guy walks up to the truck and he drops his package in there. He's a pretty big dude, right? Just huge muscles. And the truck sinks on the first one. Like it literally starts, the shocks start going down on it. And he drops it in there. He's like, I paid my fee. And the driver's a consensus driver. He goes, okay. And he's like, I also bought the next one and the next one and the next one. Next thing you know, the truck is so loaded down, he can't go more than 30 miles an hour. He's going to take more than the normal time to get to the other side. This is a DOS block. You're essentially speed limiting the truck and the speed you can make it move. And it makes it so until the truck gets to New York, the next truck will not leave. And I probably should have used planes, but yeah, essentially that's what's happening is you're slowing down that process by just weighing down the truck with this just dead tungsten or gold, or I don't even care what it is. Basically, it makes it impossible for it to move and nothing else can happen. Nobody can bid for the next truck. It's all, nothing's happening until that thing is done. So that's essentially, in Bitcoin terms, people crafting very malicious transactions designed to make Bitcoin blocks come in at very long durations because the time to ship them or validate them or get them to the other side.
And also to clarify, like, this isn't some guy who accidentally has a package which is too heavy. These are like known. It's like, this is a guy who like spent a long time accumulating all that tungsten, putting it in a package, and like being like, I'm going to get them and like actually, nuke the whole like transport. Okay. So this is a very good analogy. I'm going to start using this.
Thank you.
I invite you to start using some more technical language of like what tactically happens when a pool is trying to validate a block, and when maybe my own node that I run at home is trying to validate a block, because these are important like building blocks. And maybe if you want, there's the actual mining rigs, the people who run the mining data centers, like what role do they play here? This is an open question. How do you think to best kind of like take this?
Let's tackle it from the perspective of the node runner versus the miner, because both have very different functions in Bitcoin. The miner is somebody. Okay, I'm gonna real quick make clarifications just for the sake of like making sure language is correct. Yeah. I'm going to refer to a miner as like a pool. So if I use that term, it's interchangeable. I'm going to take the perspective of like a solo miner, and then the hashing data centers are always just like attached to this pool. But the miner is the one that is going to be attempting to produce the block for all intents and purposes. Okay. So let's take this from the perspective of the node runner. The difference between a node runner and a miner, and I'll be the miner, you'll be the node runner, and the node runner, you will use the Bitcoin blockchain to basically operate your company, take Bitcoin payments, etc. But the thing you will never be doing is creating that next block until you become a miner as a node runner. And node runners are technically, to a degree, can become miners, but all node runners are node runners. All miners are also node runners. It's a superset of node running is to mine, essentially. And so, yeah, you'll use it to take in payments, etc. But I, as a miner, I'm burning energy with my data centers that are attached to my node, doing all this work. And think of the node as like the manager, and the miners as like these workers. And they're all being commanded. So every S19 or S21 in the fleet is being told, you do this for the next certain amount of time. Just keep going. And then once I get a new block, I will tell you to start working on new work. Like that, and that's a typical thing. And for a miner, the most important aspect to not waste money is you always want to be building on the most recent chain tip or the most recent block that was built by any other miner on planet Earth. You do not want to find yourself behind a block or two, because that means those machines are just burning energy. Because even if you do solve and you like, yeah, I got my block found, but then you submit it to the network goes by the highest chain tip height. And if you're 1 or 2 behind, the network rejects it. All your work is gone. All that energy it's almost unethical to be mining on like stale tips, because of the fact that like you're literally kind of heating things for not even a monetary reward. So, but yeah, at the end of the day, how that comes into like node running versus mining is a node runner that cares about economic consequences of running a node, like getting payments. If something's delayed by like a minute or two, like, okay, cool. It's still settled and your customer probably will be okay. But a miner if they're late by a minute or two, that's a minute or two of burning like a gigawatt of energy on stale work. And if they do happen to find a block during that time, that's a problem. You just waste all that work. And then you got to figure out basically how do you get back to the chain tip. And the effect that this kind of poison transaction, this poison block has on a miner is the same thing as like basically that delivery truck. Is every miner, every time they get a block, has to check every single thing about that block to make sure that it's correct. Every single signature, every single transaction, the size, like every single package that was received in New York was a valid package. It doesn't mean it doesn't also have to be on the list of things on the truck, but it still has to be a valid package that got shipped to New York. So, but with that said, what normal blocks take in terms of time to validate, like when a miner gets the block from Foundry, maybe whatnot, it takes under like a 1/10 of a second. It's like, and burning like a gigawatt for that amount of time sucks, but there's no way around it. There's no better solution because you have to validate it and it will always take some amount of time.
And this is part of Bitcoin's design where it should be easy to validate, hard to produce.
Yep. 100%. Or hard to counterfeit, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, with signatures. Like it's very easy to produce if you have the private key. It's very hard to counterfeit, or in proof of work, it's kind of like, that's a whole different topic. But ultimately, what happens is that normally these blocks take a certain amount of time to get basically validated and added to the chain tip. Think of like a Lego tower or whatever. Like each Bitcoin block's a Lego. They get the block from Foundry, they check it out, they look at it, put it right on top. Okay, good. And then they start trying to make the next Lego. Because if you make the next Lego, you get 350K USD in terms of exchange rate, 3.125 Bitcoin plus fees, which can be good if you're Mara, bad if you're other pools. I'm just kidding. Sorry for the joke. But so basically, like, your goal is to like always keep stacking the Lego on. But what the kind of the thing I'm talking about really, if you're like the slow truck being delivered, but a miner, if they get one of these blocks, that's one of these DOS blocks, you as a merchant would stall for 25 minutes or whatever while this validates. You'd probably still be fine. Again, like your customer, like, hey, why my payment not going through? Eventually, though, you go, you're good. But a miner, they're looking at this Lego, trying to see if they should do anything with it. During that process of looking at this thing, the node stops responding to a lot of these different RPC commands, get block template. So whatever you're working on right before you get this like really very hard to understand Lego to put on top of your chain, you sit there and you spin. You're working on old work. If other pools move forward, you get orphaned off. Like it's a massive problem because you can essentially make miners waste energy. If you're a very clever miner, you can actually send this off directly to the bigger pools and give yourself a little bit of time on your own. You could deliberately tune the difficulty of the Lego to validate, or this transaction to validate, to make it like, it's just about 2 minutes, so I won't get orphaned off, but I still get like 1/5 of the average block time to myself. Like you could use this in a lot of very malicious ways. And then to combine it with that, even if like somebody else puts a Lego on while you're looking at this one, the attacker essentially gets those transactions back and they could just send off another block. They could do this in perpetuity. Basically, once this thing, the setup exists to make this block, until that those transactions get out of the chain, they can just recycle this again and again and again. And like, so it creates a lot of problems for Bitcoin miners that want to mine honestly. It creates a problem for node runners who want to validate because of the fact that I was using kind of like a nice time of 25 minutes, but that's a really fast computer. If this thing gets on a Raspberry Pi, that was an 11-hour block I demonstrated at OpNext. So
yeah. So for the listener here, like this, what Portland is taught, I'm going to try to rehash what you just said.
Sure.
The problem is, it is possible to create a block which is so heavy and difficult to validate that a lot of people on the Bitcoin network, a lot of nodes, it is so long to validate that it almost kind of makes them impossible to interact with the Bitcoin network. And this can be used in very malicious ways, and it can be used profitably too. So there's absolutely a whole game theory about this. So I'm going to invite you. So let's, if somebody made it this far, we're now going to get into the actual technical weeds of this.
Yep.
Portland, I know you want to obfuscate some of the details, so we won't give you the actual code or anything, but I'm going to invite you now to try to explain tactically how this works, and then we'll explain the implications in game theory.
Yeah.
So how do you make a poison block?
Essentially, the first thing to making a poison block is you got to kind of do a little bit of research, probably. Even this podcast could be technically considered some research into this topic, as you'll probably understand more about this coming out of it than when you started. Second thing is you got to know a little bit of code. Third, you have to know a miner that will accept your poison transactions and your poison block. And the fourth thing is you'd have to just execute on that, like literally actually do the act of it. And so the majority of what you could do today, like to understand this like at a deeper level, is you can interact with your Bitcoin software. And I highly suggest like don't do this on testnet, because if you do discover the cookbook, you don't want to like give this out publicly and go like, hey, like everybody that wants to understand this, how this is done, go to testnet block XYZ. Please use what's called regtest, which is basically a Bitcoin node with its own little Bitcoin network. And you can interact between these very, very safely. And that's the key. It's like nobody's going to see what you're doing. You definitely can validate it. You can even demonstrate it to other people. Like, I was able to do this. You'll come to the same conclusion that this is the problem. But yeah, so that's what you need. So ultimately, how do you first go about solve or understand like what the problem is? So right now in Bitcoin, we have a very nice system to limit kind of like the crappy packages that go into the van, it's called a SigOps limit. What SigOps are, they're signature operations. They're what secure your Bitcoin transactions. When you use your cold card, you're essentially putting a signature on your transaction, and a SigOp is in a Bitcoin block the count of the number of signatures that's going to have to validate. So if you send me with like a Taproot address, Charlie, and you send me 5,000 Bitcoins because I'm a good guy, you're going to put a signature on it. And then, you're going to put it in the Bitcoin block. And then what'll happen is you'll increment the SigOp counter by 1, assuming you're using just a standard single sig. And so, okay, that's 1, but where's the limit? In SegWit, it's 80,000. If you want to use maybe an older address type, it's 20,000. And the reason why SegWit's different is because SegWit patched when using SegWit this problem. But the legacy stuff, you really only have room for 20,000 of these like signature checks because they're very heavy, hard to do. And remember, every package has to have some weight. That's part of the weight is the signature check. But the problem is, why is that limit different between like SegWit and why is it different between the two legacy? Satoshi made mistake. Though Satoshi, I'm just going to say, like, this is actually like a really big mistake in kind of the idea of like how this complexity counter was done. And so remember how I said the observer looks at the Lego, or the miner looks at it before he puts it on top of the stack? Well, that is what happens with anything in like the inputs for SegWit, is like it counts and limits that number of like how complex could this Lego be. But what happened when Satoshi created Bitcoin, the complexity counter was not counted when the guy was looking at this. It was actually counted by the person producing the block that was on top of the chain before him or whatever. So basically that SigOp counter was incremented when it was registered onto the time chain as an output, like basically sending it the money to me, not when it was going to be redeemed. And so what that does, that creates an arbitrage opportunity for an individual to use as an attack vector, which is essentially, I'm going to basically burden up front all these blocks with that complexity, those SigOps, count that counter, but I'm going to redeem them in this very hard to validate block where things are actually being checked. Because when you put the transaction, when you send me through that Taproot address, there's no check for the SigOp right there. It doesn't happen at that point. It happens when it's being validated. And so what happens is, you can essentially create the worst block you can create in Bitcoin has a SigOps value of 0. It's not even 20,000. It's not 80,000. It's 0 because all the complexity was checked for its complexity outside of when the person is redeeming it. It's basically the same thing as trusting somebody to tell you, like, I tell you, Charlie, I'll mow your lawn, right? And I don't ask how complex is your lawn to mow. And I quote you, I'll do it for 15
minutes. And I show you, and it's this giant maze, and it's
a giant maze. There's hedges and stuff. And then you got thistle bushes all over the place.
Yeah. That's
what happens with this, was that the checking for the job that's being checked on is happening somewhere else. And then you're basically, that would be the similar analogy, is basically redeeming a bunch of these thorny lawns and huge mazes in a single block where the guy just quoted you the regular price for everything. And it creates a massive problem, because the miner will take this and he will sit there and he will validate. The node will take it and sit there and validate it until it's deemed invalid. Nothing else happens on that Bitcoin node until that process is done. So essentially,
the Bitcoin node is like paralyzed in colloquial terms, kind of.
Yeah. Okay. So now we kind of got the idea of how this thing works. Basically, the goal is to burden the SIGOPS in outside the block that you're redeeming in. So you create a bunch of setup transactions in other blocks. You use up their SIGOP counts so that when you go to do your block, there isn't a high SIGOPS count in it, or in this case, a zero SIGOPS count. So, okay, you create a bunch of these. I'm not going to go into the code to do this, but yeah, you can create a very high or very hard to validate transaction that has about 66 SIGOPS in it, each one. And you continuously like kind of stack these together for about 115 blocks. You can do shorter, you can do longer, depending on how big you want this impact to be. And then ultimately what you do is, once you've got all these setup transactions, or these boxes full of tungsten, kind of like loaded up, ready to, or just kind of set up. Actually, I'm going to go back. That what you have right now is you, the individual, have brought your boxes to be shipped. You haven't quite shipped them yet, but you've got everything set up. You got boxes all around you. You're standing in the middle of these things, and you're going to go to the driver. You're going to tell him, hey, you're going to ship this entire truck of these things. And so what happens next is essentially you redeem all of these transactions. You say, hey, I put all these on the time chain. I'm going to spend from these very, very heavy transactions with lots of SIGOPS. And then you add them to your inputs of the your block transaction. And this transaction takes up the entire block. It's 1 megabyte, because we're dealing with all legacy old stuff in Bitcoin here. And you can't go to forks. There's no SegWit. But yeah, essentially this transaction takes the whole block, and you will create 22,000 inputs from these setup transactions. This is much bigger than any transaction. Charlie's, to me, was one.
Like a normal transaction for the listener might be like, 1 to a couple handfuls of inputs, depending on how much you're sending.
Yeah, this is like 22,000. Again, with all this is all, anybody who partakes in this is deliberately doing this. There's no way, there's no financial transaction, there's no meta protocol transaction that would ever need to do this activity. So basically what happens is you create this giant transaction with 22,000 inputs, and you say, spend. And that block is valid. It's completely valid. Your node, as the miner, has already cached all these transactions. It's already done the validation, all the work, because of the fact that it has accepted it into its mempool. So when it builds a block, and you're the miner doing this, it's all ready to go. So to you, it feels like nothing. But then you send this thing off to the network. Your node gets it, Charlie, and you notice, hey, like my instance of mempool isn't working. Sparrow's broken. Like, what's going on? And you check your logs, and it's like, it's just sitting there with saw new block header, but nothing's getting connected to your chain. Your RPC is starting to time out. Your node's broken. There's nothing you can do at this point except for just wait. Because if you turn your node off and restart it, it's just going to do the same exact thing again. The RPC doesn't work because you can't invalidate block because it's too busy processing the block. You're going to be sitting there for 11 hours on a Raspberry Pi while this goes on. So the more nodes that get this, the worse the attack is. And the way like somebody who was smart enough would do it is they would disable the peer limits on Bitcoin. So they would go, hey, instead of just having the normal 125 peers, they would basically act like a Chainalysis company and connect to thousands of peers. Mine this block, poof, out to the network. Everybody's just kind of stalled out. And so that's what would happen to node runners, is like 11 hours of just things not working. A Coinbase can't figure out how to get their node to get up to the chain tip. Actually, I take that back. There's one way you could do this. You could actually just you could clear the entire node out and re-download the entire time chain again.
Let me tell you about one of the most slept on opportunities in crypto. Arch is building fast, composable DeFi apps on Bitcoin. Arch apps tap into the OG blockchain with by far the most liquidity and best brand in crypto. I've known the team for over a year. The tech they're building is solid, and they are racing towards mainnet. There's dexes like Saturn, meme coins on funkybit.fun, instant loans on Cha-Ching, and so much more. Plus, they're rewarding testnet users, so join me in trying out Arch while it's still early. Okay, so not everyone's running a Raspberry Pi, although that is like a predominant use case. A lot of people running, their Umbrel on the Raspberry Pi. It's the simple one out of the box. It tends to work. And we use the Raspberry Pi as a good, reference point for like, people should be able to run a node on a Raspberry Pi.
It's the weakest arrow in the bundle, basically. Like,
We've debated this endlessly. But miners, pools, the people who produce these, they're running on like top end server hardware, ideally, but at least they're not running on Raspberry Pis. They're running on like enterprise grade hardware. And, but is that still a risk even for them? Like, and this is where I'm going to invite you to go. Like, this is beyond just crippling some node runners. This could get into, profitable pool games, profitable block production games.
Yeah. So basically, in my testing, I used a Xeon server that is the equivalent of what any reasonable pool would use outside of maybe some very advanced like DevOps people. But even then, if you used a top of the line, maybe like a Threadripper or something, you might get like a 2 to 3x improvement on this result. But the worst case validation time is 25 minutes for a very sophisticated miner. So your Raspberry Pi, like your weak little node is 11 hours, but the actual pool is 25 minutes. That's a substantial amount of time to be burning gigawatts of energy for no good reason other than to prove that this block that can be added to the chain so you can start mining on the next chain tip. And to note, like, if this block does get mined on top of, it creates a completely different problem in the short term for anybody who wants to validate the chain. Your little Raspberry Pi, if this thing actually sticks and one miner mines this block and another miner sits there and validates and then puts one on top of it, when you go to sync your Raspberry Pi and you hit this DOS block, 11 hours of time, you'll notice it'll just stop. So you just added 11 hours to the IBD right there. That's why you want to keep this thing like off the chain, because once it's in there, you can't really get rid of it either. You can do like
it's part of the chain. Does it even if you're doing headers only? Does that still?
No, headers only. You get to bypass the rule, but headers only creates an entirely different problem. And headers only is for miners typically. Okay. So, but what I'd say is like assume valid is the way you kind of bypass this in the chain. So like if this block does get stuck, after enough time, the Bitcoin Core devs apply what's called assume valid to some chain height right before the release. And what that means is don't validate the signatures. The hashes of the transactions are good enough. And what that means is that time to check that it's good goes away, goes right to zero. So eventually it'll smooth out. But in the short term, until that assume valid is placed into the new version of Bitcoin Core, there will be like new node runners will have to download this and validate for 25 minutes to like 11 hours. But yeah, like miners this is a totally different way of thinking about this problem. The way that it affects mining is miners are highly dependent on, first of all, new chain tip. That is number one. Always get to the new chain tip as fast as possible to start mining on top of that so you can get your reward. Two, to do that, all those data centers full of these machines need access to what's called like the Bitcoin Core RPC. And I'm abstracting it out. They don't directly need access, but the pool software does. But what the problem that's caused by that right here is that when you submit this hard to validate block to a miner, their node starts spinning, so they don't get to the chain tip. And to like amplify the problem, they actually stop, like the RPC stops, so that they don't submit new jobs to their miners. They're doing the same thing. They may even just like, if the pool doesn't know to shut down, they'll start reusing nonces and nonce space. Like you're just completely just double dipping on work. In this case, it's a complete mess. But how would I use this as like an advantage? If you're a big miner and you want to win more blocks and you can like you deem it to be profitable enough to do so, you would essentially like kind of tune one to, okay, let's do a couple hundred setup transactions in the block before this, or maybe every block that you mine, because you're able to create the block and you don't have to apply the list of things that are okay to ship. Maybe you include your own setup transactions in your block and you just go, okay, on the next one, I'll redeem. So along with being hard to validate, you're also like setting up the next attack block and you continuously like, okay, we'll make it an extra 2 minutes of validation, right? And you use that time alone on the network to basically mine for yourself while everybody else is spinning their wheels, giving you an advantage to mine another block.
Like 2 minutes for context, I'm just back in the napkin math here. If we're looking at average block time of 10 minutes, 2 minutes is 20% of that. This, I'm going to hand wave and make a generalization. This would basically have a similar effect to giving you 20% more hash rate.
It's actually like, depending on how much of the network you attack using this block, you're actually reducing the total network hash rate by that amount. So if let's say you have you have 50, or that's a bad number. Let's use 49%. Okay. 49% of the hash rate. Well, if you have the ability to target, like, the IP addresses of basically like the other 51% or whatever, essentially, if you submit this block out to them, their hashes are completely wasted. They're not getting added to the chain tip. If you do this every block that you mine, it'll essentially appear as if 20% of the remaining 51% had just gone away. So you'll basically give yourself a 10% advantage, I think, back in the napkin by doing something like that. And you can continuously kind of increase or tune this parameter, because there's one part where things get really messy. And that's when people start having to do manual intervention, like AKA like peer block you, right? Or just like invalidate blocks that contain or change the consensus on their nodes to like prevent this from happening. Because once you can catch somebody by surprise, but if this starts becoming a thing, like 100% miners will be working with developers to figure out solutions to these kind of problems to keep their nodes up to the chain tip.
Exactly, and that's a responsive thing where now the various miners have to either internally or reach out to developers, probably all of the above at the same time, work to respond and mitigate, figure out who's causing it, how to mitigate it. This is human time. This is dev time. This is communication. This is a global network. People do go to sleep sometimes. And that, and the clock is ticking immediately. This could take a day, several days. It could take, I don't know, like do you have a good sense for like what the real human like response time could be in a median scenario?
I don't actually know how you solve this problem elegantly right now, given Bitcoin Core's current like interface with the Bitcoin Core RPC. Like, you can't, the easiest thing would be to essentially, like, as a miner, like, okay, I see something's going on. Maybe Foundry got one of these things popped off. Bad deal, right? But it looks like, hey, there's still setup transactions. Another one may be coming. Like, at the end of the day,
a second plane is about to hit the tower.
Yeah. Whoa. Yeah. So, but it's like, okay, like, you have a problem. You see, like, okay, something's gonna actually, yeah. So essentially, from there, like, the grub brain would be, okay, invalidate block. So you'd have some guy sit at a computer like this all day and like monitor your template generator at your pool, and you would go, I see it. Okay. And then invalidate block, and then you copy the hash over, take it off. Okay, cool. We're mining on the old tip. This is a DOS block for sure. We'll take the risk of like mining on the old tip real quick, because this is poison. We don't want it. But when he would go to do that, his RPC would stop. Like, it just wouldn't respond. It would give you a timeout message. Okay, well, that's bad. I can't get this out of the system. Okay, let's like reboot the node. Oh, that's not going to work either, because it's just going to revalidate it again. Like, the most you could do is like snapshot yourself at a safe block and go like, okay, restore snapshot at this height, and then like stop it from connecting to the network momentarily, invalidate like that block hash. So when it comes through, it doesn't actually happen. Like, it's really difficult because it's all like a very manual process right now to deal with. And there's no elegant in Bitcoin way that I know of, or that anybody's described to me, even post my talk it up next, to just like, hey, you got the DOS block in here. How do you get it out of your node so that you can continue mining? And so, yeah, ultimately that is the real problem for a pool, is like, even if you have these devs, what it'll come down to is what I talked about in the first op next, which was like, do we need a Bitcoin soft fork? And at that point, you have a very concise answer to this problem. Yes, you need a soft fork. This isn't like, hey, CTV, should we activate or not? I guarantee you, every investor, every miner, every business is going to be going, Antoine, release the code. And then Antoine will go, yes. And then then they'll emergency activate the fix to specifically miners, because again, the role of miners is to add these things to the chain. And so at that point, this fix is pretty easy to implement. It's kind of already there. And so they would basically emergency upgrade their version of Bitcoin Core. It would take that limit or the complexity of those SIG-ops and go, well, if you're doing it using the outputs of previous transactions, you can only go up to that same number or something like that. And then at that point, the miners would all very safely mine. And if another miner produced one of these very poison blocks, that block would actually just get rejected, and that miner would be punished by wasting their work because they weren't able to actually successfully stall out the hash rate on their peers to gamify this poison block.
I want to invite you to actually kind of reprise what you just said, because you use a lot of contextual language, which if there's someone listening here, because the listener probably doesn't know who Antoine is, they don't know, we're going to assume they know what a soft fork is. But like what I hear you saying is, there is a fix to this specific problem. Why haven't we done it? What's going on here? And does it just solve this? Like what's going on?
Believe it or not, yes, it just solves this. And so at the end of the day, Antoine is a Bitcoin Core developer who has been working exclusively on what's called the Great Consensus Cleanup. And why it's called the Great
GCC for short.
GCC for short. And why that is really important is it's kind of it. Okay, first of all, the GCC is a soft fork. There's it is modifying consensus rules, shrinking them to fix things. And the reason why it's called the Great Consensus Cleanup is because it's going through and cleaning up like tech debt or problems that have been in Bitcoin. I have not focused a lot on specifically like the other elements, the time warp attack, 64-byte, that stuff. I've been very interested in specifically this problem of the poison block, because I don't think that it should be in Bitcoin. This should not be possible in the laws of physics that are Bitcoin consensus. Yeah, we have the fix. It's bird in hand. Why is it not here? Why aren't miners running that? Well, the reality is that soft forks in Bitcoin are incredibly contentious. They're also somewhat dangerous too. A lot of times, I don't think necessarily the GCC, but like they're associated with bigger changes, things you want to use these things very sparingly, because you're changing the rules to Bitcoin forever, permanently restricting them in some way. And so right now, the poison block, nobody's demonstrated a desire to do this. There's no indication that anybody wants to do this right now. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but there hasn't been an urgency. Nobody's put together like the threat. Nobody's even put one of these, like, remember how I said you have to kind of get the setup transactions ready? You got to package up your tungsten to load in the truck. Nobody's put one of these on the time chain yet. Antoine has mentioned, he's like, look for these. He hasn't seen any of them. Nobody's even done it on testnet yet. It's all been like internal and hypothetical. Can I? No.
Yeah. What you're saying is like, I mean, to me, if I listen to this whole thing and you're telling me I'm like, oh shit, like, you mean this is vulnerability? All the Bitcoin devs, they should be all over this. Yet we have really only a handful of people who have discussed this. Mm-hmm. It's kind of been this fringe issue or this fringe topic. And yet it seems to me like it could be a possibly an existential risk alongside like these other known attack vectors. Like, why has this not been a well-known issue? Is this something that people know about and they just don't think it's very likely? Do you think there's maybe a veil of ignorance? Do you think there's complacency?
Complacency. It just comes down to that. Do Bitcoin core devs want to go out on a limb and deal with the public on social consensus forming around this specific problem? And then the other thing too is like, at the end of the day, node runners don't have any impact on this change because they're not mining these poison blocks. It could potentially protect them during validation, and enforce the rules better. But you could solve this problem pretty nicely by just implementing the GCC on 51% of mining or 51% of hash rate. Because even if somebody were to create the poison block in the minority hash rate, their block wouldn't even get to the point of looking at the Lego to see if they could stack it. It would just get thrown away right away. It wouldn't pass even the most basic consensus checks, fail fast. And so ultimately what happens there is I think people would, I can't say because I'm not on the inner dev circle on this one. Like I do talk to Antoine a lot more post your conference, but like all that research was on my own to do this. And so what happens, I do believe, is that this fix can be deployed pretty fast at the mining level, especially right now, because of the fact that you would only need to get 51%. You could go to Foundry, you can go to Antpool, and you can hit one other, and you could basically get the entire patch in the network. So
this, maybe we can zoom out a little bit. In your presentation at OpNext,
yeah.
You had a very spicy slide, which you delivered incredibly softly. And the slide, an orange slide, it says, you say, quote, currently relay policy and mining centralization are acting as guardians of the network, preventing this behavior on Bitcoin. Miners don't want to blow up their pools, and devs have abstracted away the need for miners to know how any of this works. None of this means it can't happen because consensus is king, which is kind of what you said. It's complacency, but we've been arguing a lot about relay policy and mining, and this goes alongside mining centralization.
Yeah.
And what's funny is you, on one hand, you and I are both vocal anti-filter camp, but on the other hand, it's funny because this effect has kind of been a de facto guardian mechanism, which is actually, to me, this is kind of a black pill, like that we're not really thinking adversarially.
No, not at all. It's like, but the reality is though, when it comes down to it, Slipstream was the product that exposed me to, like, when I created Slipstream, nobody talked to me about this. I had no idea. I'd been in Bitcoin a while. Nobody's ever brought up the set of words that lead you to the 9 pages of the whole internet that talk about this. But when Mara said, hey, we're ripping off all standardness policy in Bitcoin, and we get the emails from various devs going, what the are you doing? Have you looked into this? And they'll email you an entire list of like all the things. And I go, check. I covered that. Looks good. But there was one on that list that wasn't covered. And it was way worse than I thought. It was like, even before your conference, I didn't know how bad this was. But that was the DOS block. And they said, hey, have you covered like a lot of specific opcodes being used in the outputs of transactions? Actually, they didn't even say the outputs of transactions. They just said, did you cover a lot of the specific check sigs, right? And I was like, okay, yeah, I'll just patch it. And the way I patched it was I just limited the number of these that could be introduced into a non-standard Slipstream transaction, which does solve the problem. Great. Nobody can create the setup transactions using Slipstream. But at the end of the day, though, that's why relay policy, which is like kind of the filter, the list on the side of the truck that says what can be shipped, is acting as this guardian, because it says no tungsten on the side. The driver goes, no, you can't put this on this truck. But if, in Mara's case, we decided to take the list off the side of the truck. Sorry, I apologize. And then, so what happens when you do that is like, okay, we'll ship anything. And if you want to ship anything that was on that list, we'll just charge you more money for it. And then, so what happens is that these public miners have a reputation to maintain, a stock price that must be high. So the narrative that could come from basically a pool that didn't know about this, or just inadvertently decided to try to make a few extra bucks by turning off standardness policy, could turn into a headline on Bloomberg that, hey, Pool X has just attacked Bitcoin with a DOS block through a Slipstream-like product. And that's kind of like what ultimately relay policy is doing for the miners, is it's protecting their reputation a lot, because it's putting them in this nice little box of like, we've all agreed that there's, other than maybe like the 40-byte op return, we've all kind of agreed that these are the safe transactions. It's a very small set of transactions, but it's very safe. It doesn't mean you're going to make the most money. Slipstream has proved incredibly well you can make a lot of Bitcoin not applying these rules. But at the same time, it's like we've all agreed from the terms of like what we like and that these are like the things that are the safest things to ship. It doesn't, and I think some of it is just like a little bit of like, just don't add arbitrary data. A lot of it is around op return. These kind of policies don't add arbitrary data. But at the end of the day, like every miner is running the standardist policy to protect their reputation, but inadvertently in protecting their own reputation, they're protecting the Bitcoin network right now from being attacked by somebody who does want to be malicious, because country X or Y can't submit these setup transactions because they just don't get mined anywhere. Mara even puts in like, hey, we're not going to allow that to happen. And so this kind of goes into the next portion of this where, okay, we're going to grant the cursed monkey paw wish to Bitcoin today. Bitcoin mining is decentralized. Like we're not
permissionless. You don't need permission to submit a block.
It's there's no more permission. There's no more like there's hundreds of thousands of pools all over the planet. The mempool.space pie chart just looks like a cluster rainbow or something, like a pinwheel. It's all decentralized. Congratulations, we solved the problem. But now that block production is so decentralized, any one of these people can be bribed to do this activity. If Nation Y goes, hey, I know that you seem to get like basically one block every 2 days. Could you do this for $5 million?
Yeah, it's like everybody, the thing is like everybody's thinking about nation state game theory. I'm like, okay, what if the US has all the Bitcoin stockpile and then a small little nation state once, has their own in-house mining operation? They're like, well, we see if it's a North Korea situation, they don't have to build a nuke. They can just mine a single block and like
just wreak havoc on infrastructure.
Exactly. And so, we're not thinking adversarially, is what I hear.
The incentive has to be really high for somebody to want to do this. This is I'm basically discussing this from the perspective of a malicious nation state that wants to basically cause problems for the Bitcoin network operation. And so far, we haven't really seen that. The game theory has actually been for most nation states to like maybe ban Bitcoin at the civilian level, but they're still stacking. Everybody's still stacking. Everybody wants that NGU. It's so powerful. Then you can also see that like the desire to attack Bitcoin, it's a lot lower than I would expect. The core devs release these new CVE exploits every time a version gets end of life, and they go through like, here's exactly the recipe to stop a node from operating that is this version. My primary node, it's at version 25. It's vulnerable to like 10 of these things. Nobody's even taking the time to do it. Like, the thing is, it's not going to be a problem until it is a problem. It's just one of those things that once it's seen, oh my goodness, it happened. Same thing with Slipstream. Oh my goodness, it happened. Like the fact that the policy to like kind of like tell miners like, hey, you shouldn't do this is like you get emails from people like in a decentralized like cursed monkey paw wish. Who do you email when you see that they've turned off their standardist policy? How do you find the guy in like South Africa or Brazil who's doing this? You can't. And the other thing is they're bribed so much money, they're not going to care that they're doing this. So I don't know. It's like, you got to think adversarially, but the fix is pretty easy overall. And the fix can be implemented right now at the pool level.
So I want to get your take, because it's been a year. It's been, as we said, a wild year. A lot has happened. We've had a billion narratives. You and I have participated in all of these. We've been the main character. We've been a side character. We've been, a shadow government in some of these. And we talked on some, last time, this podcast a year ago, we touched on like some interesting topics, which have been the subject of some of these exact arguments today. I want to get where your head's at on some of these today at the end of May. I remember, and we won't, I won't lead this into a filter op return discussion, but this time last year, I asked you, what your thoughts were on client diversity and like Bitcoin Core as the dominant client. Has your views on this evolved or changed, or do you view this in a more nuanced way? you don't have to answer this question directly because it's a sensitive, challenging topic.
No, I'll answer it.
I invite you to comment on this.
From my perspective, Mara's running an alternative client. The client you run that's your right as a Bitcoiner. You have to understand the risk of doing so. You can fork the network. If enough people get together with enough economic basically influence or basically social consensus or the ability to form social consensus, that would be nodes providing economic value, miners, or even influencers have some ability to kind of dictate these things over long periods of time. Hey, run this specific client for your business, etc. And over enough time, you could start creating basically a new implementation that becomes somewhat dominant on the network and has influence. And that's what matters. Me spinning up 10,000 nodes on AWS and going, look at number go up on Bitcoin nodes. It means nothing. It's nothing. Those nodes don't do anything. If you get mining pools to run your implementation, that's a lot of influence in terms of social consensus. You got one half right there of basically enforcement of the rules. The other half is the node runners, the economic actors. It's a balance. But in terms of that, 100%, I do support people's ability to run alternative implementations. I still kind of go back to, I want there to be a single reference implementation that people use in the way that Satoshi said, if client diversity increases too much, then you're very likely to end up fracturing the network at some point where you'll have a portion split off. And with that, Bitcoin Core is that today, right? And so everybody that talks about Bitcoin implementations, whether it's Knots, it's Libra, it's Slipstream, it's the Bugle Core now, it's all the same implementation of Bitcoin Core that has been changed ever so slightly to become a different brand. That's all it is. And that is okay to me to do because it's kind of just little policy changes and the chances of diverging on a consensus issue are pretty low. But you also have alternative implementations that are more kind of I would say dangerous to run and have proven to be a little bit more problematic. BTCD, the back end of LND, broke because they didn't have the right consensus implementation for stack item counting. There's also proven ones that seem to be working quite okay. Floresta. I run one of those Rust nodes. It's not Bitcoin Core at all. It's just some guy writing Rust code. It's been working, right? But I have to understand, would I want to mine on something like that? No, I probably mine an invalid block. I just don't trust it. So at the end of the day, node runners, choose your node, whatever you want. It's pick your Pokemon, right? But understand that you deep down, you do want all these things to kind of have a unified core of consensus. The consensus validation mechanism needs to be the same for all of these. And with that said, how I describe this problem would be that think of a video game emulator. Okay. And so Charlie, you have the original Mario Brothers cartridge. I go, haha, I'm just as cool. I have an NES emulator on my computer where I downloaded a ROM. Ideally, they both should form the exact same game experience given the same input. So if you wire your controller and you split it into both the original cartridge and mine,
you're going to compete in speed runs,
sure,
yeah.
But this is actually more important than the speed run because that implies some variance. Here, what I'm talking about is the original cartridge is Bitcoin Core, and the emulator is I'll just say Slipstream, right? It should be correct. It should be close, but it's not technically the same hardware or anything. And so we plug one controller in there, Charlie, and you're pretty good, so I'll have you play. So you plug it into both the emulator and the NES. So they both start at the exact same time. The random number generator seeds are the exact. So what happened is we now decide that we're going to look at every pixel on the screen for every frame. And that's the way Bitcoin consensus, every frame is a block. Okay. Block one over time. And we go and we're playing through the level. Okay. And then we get to the flagpole and you jump. And okay, you jump and you go. And at the last minute, it diverges just slightly. The emulator is actually 3 pixels higher because of some floating point bug. What that is at that point, that's a fork. That is literally a fork. My client, whichever one has consensus, if everybody's using the emulator like me, you're forked off. If everybody's using the original cartridge, which is the case right now, everybody's using Bitcoin Core, I get forked off the network. And at that point,
we're talking about potentially hundreds of billions of dollars. We're talking about a lot of money.
Yeah. And for miners, that's energy, economic activity. And where it gets really kind of nasty is when we don't have a good, like, when we have like a split in the middle where you have like 60% running core and you have like 40% running the emulator version, and we've split apart now. And maybe at the point of the split, there was a very valuable transaction, maybe a DAO hack size transaction. And then on one side, that transaction didn't happen, but on the other side, it did. And then, okay, well, at that point, like, how do you economically decide like a reason through who is correct? You could end up with, okay, we all move to one side and validate, or you could literally end up with like a subset of like, hey, Bitcoin emulator and then Bitcoin original cartridge that's still running. And then you've split the network from something like that. And that's the danger of alternative clients, is right there.
So the next, I think, last subject, I have been trying to document the soft fork discussion really for the past pretty much 2 years. And I've run this podcast long enough, so I've had a few guests on twice. And now it like represents like the arc of time, and people's minds change and people's sense of the current landscape change. And I always like to ask what people think of what they personally think about any specific software proposals or what they would like to happen. So I throw this to you, Portland. You clearly want one specific component of the great consensus cleanup. I think this is, I also did too. That's not the question. Are there other soft forks that you think would be productive, that you think we should look at sooner rather than later? Again, those are relative terms, but yeah.
No, not right now. I think like get the GCC merged and clean this up at the miner level, and then like let's talk about niceties. My opinion would be very different if the mempool weren't empty every day. Like I think that something like the only thing that I feel this is also subjective and wishy-washy. I don't like necessarily like saying these kind of things, but I guess like I have stated in the past, like something like CTV, I think would be a pretty nice little addition to Bitcoin. It would help with like scaling because you could kind of like roll things up and do VUTXOs, etc. But at the end of the day, we don't have a usage problem on chain in terms of like space constraints. What I think we have more so is a use case constraint. Like people just aren't using Bitcoin on chain a lot, and maybe all the activities move to Lightning. But I'm not quite convinced of that either, because I would see a lot more channel opens and closes. What really would cause the need to kind of have one of these additional soft forks was if you could prove like, hey, like, okay, if we added this would create like more on-chain activity, or this would allow more people to get on-chain, which would be good. Make sure these things are always in our back pocket. So if the day ever comes, but right now, like, I think that Bitcoiners, like, we need people to be doing stuff with Bitcoin, whether that be like marketplaces where you sell t-shirts, or like institutional adoption is doing, like institutions are doing transfers between each other. Like that Blockspace right now just being so empty. What has gone wrong at the social level to cause people not to be doing on-chain transactions? I don't personally believe it's the cost. I sent Bitcoin for like a couple of like 30, 40 cents. I don't think it's like people are going, hey, I can't do Bitcoin because for my business because of the cost right now. I think it's more of like a social thing of like, hey, if I take this for my business, what tax implications? How do I integrate this into the existing social framework and deal with the kind of the consequences of using Bitcoin that have really turned people kind of like off on the idea of using Blockspace? And then the other component is like, you absolutely can have NGU happen without creating constraints on Blockspace that would warrant like additional scaling based soft forks, right? And we've seen that right now. We're at a Bitcoin all-time high in terms of US dollars NGU, and the mempool cleared on, I think it was like Wednesday, like completely cleared. So yeah, it's like hodlers are really, it's good to be a hodler because you watch the value of your stack, your purchasing power increase a lot. But at the end of the day, that doesn't create new arguments for soft forks. Like it's you hodling is just like, it's not creating any activity on Bitcoin. It's not creating new transactions that would even use these soft forks. Maybe op vault, but I really don't necessarily like the implementation a whole lot on that. I don't know. That's my opinion.
So, well, I often share similar statements such as like, if Bitcoin transaction activity explodes, we'll be crying for some soft fork. Like part
absolutely.
Really the big problem is that is that we just don't see at $111,000 Bitcoin, we see what I would consider to be very low activity for what I thought we'd have here.
100%. Every bull run, there's been like $50, $100 Bitcoin transactions at these all-time high prices. I sent Bitcoin for 30 cents USD. It's like,
yeah. Does this, again, this may be interpreted as FUD and a leading question, but does this worry you?
No. I mean, at the end of the day, like Bitcoin will always survive, right? It's like, what state does it get into? Low fees today, not necessarily a problem because your subsidy covers kind of the economic activity and pays the miners to keep network security high. That's all you technically need. Bitcoin is designed to have prolonged periods of low fees. Things adjust. That's why you have these components to like block building, like subsidy plus fees, is to like help miners smooth over this period. Ask me in like 50 years, like if this is a problem and we're still here at 1 sat per VByte, the Bitcoin price didn't 10x, then I'll go, yeah, I don't think we're going to be sustaining like nearly as a zettahash of hash rate. And when you lose the hash rate, you lose the security, because then that hash rate doesn't, unless provably destroyed, can change hands to a nation state who then can, well, you're only securing the network for like $4,000 per block. Like it's not good. But in the short term, absolutely not a problem. I'm just saying, like, some viewpoints become incredibly distorted in the short term, and potentially even my own, because of the low fees. And like you said, if a soft fork, like let's say tomorrow fees go to like $100 a transaction, or like 2,000 sats of VByte or something, and it stays there for another like month, I think CTV would get activated pretty quick. I think people would find a lot of social consensus around that. And the other kind of distortion that happens as well is like, there are pools that mine less than profitably in terms of their fees collected currently, based on kind of like ideology. And that's fine right now, because fees don't matter a whole lot, right, compared to the relative block value. So if you take your $3,000 in fees you've collected on a $350,000 block, you cut it in half because you filtered out half the transactions, your pool members very likely won't notice anything from that. But we talk about a scenario where you're approaching like 1 Bitcoin, maybe the fees are surpassing the subsidy, and you're continuously missing out on that kind of revenue. These conversations change really quick. And the conversations around a lot of things in Bitcoin change very dynamically around fees, right? And so with that said, Lightning channels, right? Lightning seemed like a very good idea for most individuals at 1 sat of VByte to go like open up your channels, and then it's, well, 400 sats of VByte, and they're like, hey, how do I close? Just wait, please. And so with that said, like my comments about like the fee market and a soft fork not being warranted because like we're still not seeing enough on-chain transactions to justify scaling, that can all change in 2 seconds, right? The most important thing is we're ready with these soft forks. We have the brains to build out these ideas, put them into code, and have the method of activation there. So when the need comes, it will happen for better. Obviously, I hope for better. Like nobody knows the unknowns of soft forks. But if you look at soft forks historically, like feature-based soft forks, I think are like on the order of 4 or 5 total. But the number of emergency activations is like 13. And what I mean by that, emergency activations are soft forks that have happened in Bitcoin with very little to no consensus from anybody. They're just patches put into core and released, and eventually that it gets kind of filtered down into the consensus of the network by hash rate and node runners performing economic activity. And what demand does at that level of like, hey, like we can't scale, it can absolutely force that soft fork that was potentially like an option for Bitcoin, a nice to have, into suddenly this is a must have. And we've even seen people like not just soft fork, but hard fork Bitcoin over Blockspace concerns. And right, like it is absolutely a forcing mechanism, the fee market. So
I will let you sit back, reflect on our conversation, and leave us with like any kind of closing thoughts. Bitcoin's in a very interesting place right now. Corporations are buying, nation states are buying, and yet and we've got a lot of interesting dynamics. Like I go to crypto Twitter, which at all-time high Bitcoin, crypto Twitter seems like sometimes very bearish because they don't own any Bitcoin because they're all dumb. They've been spending it all on Ethereum and stuff like that. And we have a lot of interesting, like weird dynamics, and there's been a vibe shift, as Aaron would say, in Bitcoin the past few years. What are your just general reflections on Bitcoin, your role, what it looks like in the year of our Lord 2025?
I would say in terms of like just Bitcoin in general, the most important thing for Bitcoiners is just to kind of remember that Bitcoin will be okay. Like we talked about a very serious issue today, Bitcoin will be fine. Even if these things do happen, there's feedback mechanisms in place. Even number go down is a feedback mechanism to then induce new behaviors to patch problems in Bitcoin that can happen, right? From debates about specific opcodes, reducing limits. Like there's none of this stuff warrants like an emergency or an absolute must. You got to do this today in Bitcoin kind of a charge. Like I've seen in my just like, this is kind of philosophical in terms of my life. Most of the bad things I've experienced in my life, which have come from like just not just like natural causes, but like human induced. A lot of it's been caused by emergencies, like here in the US, like 9/11, the Patriot Act, and like a lot of things didn't return back to normal after that because of an emergency. COVID was yet another like emergency. And the goal is like, I think a lot of times now, I've been played this trick one too many times. It's like, you critically think, what is the emergency? Like people that claim like a specific limitation removed from an opcode will cause Bitcoin to not be the world's most pristine asset. People will be able to DOS nodes and node runners will go away and the world will come to an end for Bitcoin if this one change is made. The answer is probably not. Bitcoin will be fine. These are all arbitrary kind of things we put in. Even the DOS blocks, Bitcoin will technically survive. It won't be great, but it will survive. So I guess that would be my reflection, is just like always critically think about what you're being told in the context of like what Bitcoin is underneath the hood, because there are two sides to being a Bitcoiner and it's all part of the journey. The first part of the journey is usually most people get like NGU hooked. Like I'm going to buy, price goes up. And then you kind of go into like the phase of being a Bitcoiner where it becomes a kind of a lifestyle thing for like, and this is my journey as well. Like I said a lot of things in my early Bitcoin journey that were objectively like probably not as true, that I understood later on once I actually like proof of work, like what Bitcoin is. And that's probably actually ironically like the happiest position in any Bitcoiner's journey, because everything's magic and fairies at that point. Everything, the idea of a nation state attacking Bitcoin and doing wrong to this pristine chain isn't existent in that model. Like it's talked about as like what if China gets a bunch of hash rate, but it's kind of like in the protecting your investment thesis. It's not at the level of like, hey, okay, mining decentralization can technically allow some individual small portion of hash rate to kind of like DOS around and cause problems for the rest of the network. And so, yeah, whether or not like I'm going to apply it just broadly to everything, the GCC, my talk today, policy, whatever, there is no emergency in Bitcoin. It's literally, you could just keep using Bitcoin as is. You will have exactly the same outcomes as you have today. Transactions will get processed. Things will be okay. The second thing, like my role in Bitcoin specifically is going to be like, I want to just like be almost like an anchor towards the idea that my thesis has 100% policy should equal consensus. I don't care which way it goes. If people want to shrink it, okay. If they want to expand policy to meet consensus, like I just want to have Slipstream and by proxy myself be the reference for this is what is actually Bitcoin that is anybody can technically use. This is the full experience of Bitcoin, not filtered or whatnot. This is what is possible on Bitcoin. Right now, though, you can't technically go all the way. It's just like, that's why I do advocate for like consensus shrinking. But deep down, I hope to be like just that reference point on the other side to be just like, so at least somebody who wants to look can go like, why is somebody even giving me this viewpoint? Why does this exist on the map of things in Bitcoin today? Why is there this one position out there where this miner is going, we'll take extra money for anything consensus valid? And that's because I guess I do believe that miners should always operate rationally, profit driven. That is satisfied with mining at the level of close to consensus, right? And so, yeah, I guess that would be like my purpose, and also to like improve Bitcoin's UX and leave an impact on Bitcoin positively, not by like attacking Bitcoin to the point where it like dies or keels over, but instead basically like exposing these issues to individuals who may eventually have enough economic influence. Maybe they go work for a pool or something to go, you know what, I want to be a part of that change. Like, I don't want this to be in Bitcoin. I want to be the final straw where we actually get rid of this problem. And that's kind of like what I hope comes out of like teaching people. So my role, other than just being like potentially like this little viewpoint of like what consensus is in Bitcoin and like the properties and effects that has, but also as like a teacher. Like, I want to always try to be as objective as possible. And I want to teach people like not just the fluffy like part of my journey that was all like nice rainbows and the NGU and like just like it's going to fix everything, because it will fix everything. Absolutely, I agree. But at the same time, like, we got to understand what we are in a human system that is basically software enforced by software enforced social consensus. Sorry. And so, yeah, I want to teach people like not just all the fluffy rainbows, but also if somebody does want to understand more about like the more technical nuances of like the reality of what is Bitcoin wrapped underneath the hood, like don't ask how the sausage is made kind of thing. I want to be the person who can like accurately tell somebody this is how the sausage is made and not be wrong. Like, a lot of things that people will say, they haven't put in the proof of work. So they kind of gloss over details and they can't give an accurate representation of why this thing exists. Like why GCC, like those kind of things. So that's where ultimately I hope to be as a teacher.
Portland, thank you so much. You covered a lot, and you are a wonderful, nuanced voice. I encourage everyone to follow PortlandHODL on Twitter and then the various media and prolific, activities he's a part of. Portland, thank you so much for coming on Bitcoin Season 2. We will have you again sometime in the future. I would love to come again in the future. And thank you for hosting, Charlie. And yeah, I hope everybody learned something today.